Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament. We are looking at the New Testament church, and we have been in First Corinthians today, or the last couple of days. We've been in First Corinthians 7, looking at Paul's instruction on marriage, and we're going to continue that. If you followed along with yesterday's, it was instruction on marriage. This one's instruction on marriage part 2. So I would highly encourage you to go back and look at that one, and listen to that one first, and then listen to this one as a follow up. But it really, a little bit deeper stuff when we're looking at the instruction on marriage here. I also would encourage everyone, if you have not subscribed to our channel, to go ahead and do so. That way you get these. This is a daily Bible study. We try to do this and go deeper into the Word every single day. And so just encourage you to do that. Subscribe to that so you get the alerts and notifications. If you find these helpful, I ask that you share them. We're trying to grow this, try to reach more people. And so if you find it helpful, then I'm hoping that others would find it helpful as well. And as always, I really appreciate everyone who's been following along, or those who take the time to follow along. I know some of these are not short, and so I do appreciate that you all take the time to watch and listen to these. So we will continue this one, instruction on marriage part 2. Again, this one I'm reading again. Usually I don't read the really longer scriptures, but I just feel that this one's important enough that we dive into this one together, read this one together as we go through it. So 1 Corinthians 7, continuing this on, verses 25 through 40, he says, now regarding your question about the young women who were not yet married, he says, I do not have a command from the Lord for them, but the Lord in his mercy has given me wisdom that can be trusted, and I will share it with you. Because of the present crisis, I think it is best to remain as you are. All right, and then he kind of transitions here. So from verse 26 to 27, he transitions from the young women, which would, in the Greek here, is actual the term for virgins. So then he switches to 27, right? Talking about men, he says, "If you have a wife, do not seek to end the marriage. If you do not have a wife, do not seek to get married. But if you do get married, it is not a sin. And if a young woman gets married, it is not a sin. However, those who get married at this time will have troubles, and I'm trying to spare you those problems." As we know, Paul has always, in his writings, when we say, has always encouraged remaining single, not getting married. And his main reason for that was it encouraged and it allowed people more free time to work for the Lord. He's going to talk about that here in a little bit. But again, it's not a command, and it's not something he says you have to do. It's just something that he recommends. He says, "But let me say this, dear brothers and sisters: the time that remains is very short. So from now on, those who with wives should not focus only on their marriage. Those who weep or who rejoice or who buy things should not be absorbed by their weeping or their joy or their possessions." We'll talk about that here in a second. He says, "Those who use the things of the world should not become attached to them, for the world as we know it will soon pass away. I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. An unmarried man can spend his time doing the Lord's work and thinking how to please him, but a married man has to think about his earthly responsibilities and how to please his wife. His interests are divided. In the same way, a woman who is no longer married or has never been married can be devoted to the Lord and holy in body and in spirit. But a married woman has to think about her earthly responsibilities and how to please her husband, which is true. We know that. Many of those who are married in it. I am saying this, verse 35, I am saying this for your benefit, not to place restrictions on you. I want you to do whatever will help you serve the Lord best with as few distractions as possible. But if a man thinks that he is treating his fiance improperly, now he kind of transitions here to people who are engaged to be married, which was a common thing in this day. Sometimes that would last for more than a year, and sometimes it was set up by parents and things like that. He says, but if a man thinks he is treating his fiancée improperly and will inevitably give in to his passion, let him marry her as he wishes. It is not a sin. But if he has decided firmly not to marry and there is no urgency and he can control his passions, he does well not to marry. So the person who marries his fiancée does well, and the person who doesn't marry does even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If her husband dies, and if, as you can see, he's hitting multiple points as he writes up or concludes this section on marriage. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, and if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, only if he loves the Lord, or only someone who's another Christian. We'll look at that as well. But in my opinion, it would be better for her to stay single, and I think I'm giving you counsel from God's Spirit when I say this. So apparently, as he wraps this up, he's answering multiple questions that they had written to him and asked. But so if we go back to this, right, we finished we finished that first section yesterday with Paul saying, "Remain as you are." Right. However, you get married, and one thing I forgot to mention, and there is a theory out there or a belief out there that if you were married before you become a Christian and you got divorced, and then you become a Christian, that you are to divorce the person that you're with and go back to the original person that you're married. That's nowhere in this Bible, in the Bible, or actually that's not biblical at all. And those who are teaching that are wrong, because that destroys multiple marriage if you were to do that. But and then Paul, I think, highlights that in those last few verses there in 1 Corinthians 7, where he's saying, "Look, remain as you are, right? However you are when you become a Christian, stay there and work towards. If you have a non-Christian, or a spouse, work towards trying to make them a Christian." And so I wanted to talk about that because I forgot to mention that, because there are some people who believe that when if you become a Christian and you've been divorced and you're married to someone else, that you have to divorce the person that you're with and try to get back to and marry the person that you're with before. And that's just, honestly, that's just crazy. And so I don't mean to be mean when I say that, but the thought of that is that the Bible teaches that it is crazy. And so, but the Bible doesn't teach it. And Paul there, I think, highlights that point of stay where you were, stay as you are. Before you were Christ, those things, he's not going to hold those against you before you become a Christian. Everything's covered through grace, right? You're forgiven. So that don't worry about that. So he now transitions here to those eligible for marriage, right, or who haven't got married, and he discusses, what the advisability of being married during times of distress. And so, like I mentioned earlier, that first section, he's talking to those who are virgins. And it's, although the term can apply to men or women, it's often applied to women of married age. And then Paul uses of the term in 28 is clearly feminine. So he's probably has women in mind when he as well when he's writing that. And so, in light of what he says later in 36 and 37 and 38, it is clear that the comments in 5 and 26, sorry, are directed to any man who has been promised to be married to a virgin. And so it's kind of this, he kind of goes back and forth. He talks to women and he talks to those who are engaged or promised to be married. And so he basically gives these highlights of, hey, this is why it's a good idea not to be married. Now, if you can stay single, that's awesome. But he gives 3 reasons why it's generally preferable for single people to remain unmarried. One, single people have fewer everyday problems than married people. It's just the way it is, right? Anytime you combine 2 people into a household, into things, you're going to have more issues. You're going to have things you have to work out. So that's just, that's just simple fact. That's what he's stating. Second, because the end is near, right? Christians ought to not let marriage and the things of the world be their dominant concern. And so, I think some of the ideas that we need to focus on Christ. The primary concern about us should be Christ and eternity, and focusing on those type of things. Third, because marriage brings earthly responsibilities, especially once you have children, right, and divided interests, those who choose to remain single can devote their lives more fully to serving Christ. And there's truth in that too, right? Whenever someone gets married, there are things that they're responsible for, husband and wife, right? They have to think of the others. Once they have children, they have to think of the children. They have all these things that I won't say distract, but divide what you can do and your ability to be able to serve the Lord as faithful as you could if you were single. And so Paul's just stating these facts and about what, the difference between being married and being single. So, but he's not saying, as some scholars claim in this, that Christ would have definitely come with the Corinthians lifetime, in the Corinthian life. It kind of sounds like it when he writes that, it's like, well, don't get married because Christ's return, is near. That was all the writers kind of wrote like that. And so the purpose of 1 Corinthians in its large part is to encourage Christians to attend to the kinds of daily affairs that would be unimportant if Christ were returning within a weeks or months. And so that's kind of the idea. We see that. So Paul is providing here practical teaching concerning marriage. And then he goes into what type of, like, we're going to look at this later, what type of food to eat at a dinner party, collecting money for the needy, right, and future travel plans. And so he writes about these kind of things. So, like other New Testament writers, Paul considers all of time from the cross forward, right, to be in the last days. And so when we write about the last days, they all would write that. And so any time past the cross to whenever Christ returns is seen as the last days. And so Paul's not saying there, oh, that Christ is going to return in your lifetime. He's just writing saying, and I think personally, this, it doesn't say this, but I think personally too, I think Paul probably knew that his letters were going to go beyond just the Corinthians and probably live out through a very long time to the future. And so I think some of that's put in there as well for that. I mean, that's Chad's opinion on it. There's no fact to that, but that's just what I believe. And so basically what Paul is pointing here is simply that the form of this world, right, and its day-to-day affairs is not eternal. There's going to be an end coming. And so what he's saying is don't focus on these things, focus on the eternal. All right. He also is saying that Christians should prioritize their human relationships, marital positions, and worldly dealings accordingly. Sorry, struggling over that. He's basically saying, look, make sure, that you're not putting all this stuff above Christ and serving Christ and do that. And so that's why Paul recommends a celibate life in preference to marriage, right? But he allows for marriage. And the main reason he allows for marriage is because if a person's sexual desires prove to be too much of a temptation, which honestly, we've talked about that, is that there is fewer people who have firm control, and he calls it a gift, right? The gift of celibacy is there's very few people who have the gift of being able to just remain single, right? And not give into sexual temptations. And so Paul's saying, like, if you don't have that gift, then it's best for you to get married. But if not, then it's best for you to be married because we don't want you in sexual sin, which he talked about before that. And then he talks about a widow and can marry another man, but only if he loves the Lord. And so the encouragement here is the question appears to be, is it okay for widows who have lost their husbands to remarry? And so Paul's saying, yeah, they can get remarried. That's fine. But he has encouragement there, and he's like, his command there really is that it only be a Christian. Like, if you're going to remarry, then you can only remarry a Christian. And Paul has strongly discouraged the marriage of Christians to unbelievers. We're going to see this in 2 Corinthians as well when we study this. And so this is a good advice, not only for widows, but for also for any of us who are looking to get married, especially as Christians. We should marry other Christians, and we'll look at some more of that later on. But anyway, so he kind of just finishes it up. And like I said, he kind of finishes that last part up with answering, that last little bit of section. It seems like he's answering a lot of little questions, one after the other. And so they don't all tie together perfectly, but a lot of them do tie together. And I think that we can apply most of what he writes here to most of our situations. It makes sense. And I think most of the teachings around this are pretty clear about, yes, we should get married if you can't, but if you are, Paul encourages you to stay single, but if you can't control yourself, basically, he says get married. And then, he gives the reasons why it's best to stay single. And then he talks about, hey, if you are going to get married, and again, he talks about widows here, but I think this applies. If you're going to get married, marry a Christian. Don't marry a non-Christian, and do your best to serve the Lord. And no matter what instance you're in, no matter what your circumstances, make sure God is the primary focus of who you're trying to serve. So again, I hope everyone enjoyed these. I know these last two it's a little bit lengthy, but there's a little bit deeper here. There's a little bit of stuff that I think needed to be cleared up. But like I said before, and if you have any questions, you have anything you differ on, or say, hey, I don't agree with this, let's talk about it. That'd be awesome. I can even make extra videos on some of that stuff. I don't mind if there's questions and stuff around it. But again, I hope that clears things up. I hope that, as you go through this, that makes more sense with everything. And I know with me, every time I study these things, like I said before, I see new things. I see things that stand out that I didn't see before. And so they're always helpful. That's why I love reading the Bible. It is a living thing because you're always seeing new things and always seeing different things as you study it. But as always, I appreciate the time, everyone who takes the time to watch these, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.